By the time the very rays of sunlight broke across the horizon, a man was already standing on the pier. Although usually joyful and smiling, this particular morning he stared intently out into the distance. The expression on his face reflected his thoughts well, for at this moment in time he was pondering the meaning of life. The sun rose overhead, and the man's already red hair seemed to literally burst into flames. He was of a tall stature with a kind of stately presence about him, and he had a long, peculiar-looking mustache. He was rarely ever bothered by doubts or despondency, but today he had woken up with such thoughts as, "What do I even need all this for? What's the point?" Then, suddenly a phrase which terrified the master appeared in his mind: a creative crisis. The thought had only just started to enter the man's head when something splashed near the shore. Surprisingly, the sound distracted the man as he looked down and thought to himself, "Oh, fish." The usual smile and look of enthusiasm returned to the man's face, and he energetically walked away from the pier. Then the man literally burst into his workshop and immediately got to work. This whole time, the word fish repeatedly circled around in his head. He was no longer bothered by such heavy thoughts as the meaning of life. Over in the suburbs of Boston, the rays of morning sun were just beginning to shine through the fog set between the buildings. With his hooded head bowed down, a man walked alongside the street. He didn't look as if he were homeless, nor did he even seem intimidating despite the baggy outfit. The silhouette and gait of the man seemed to imply that he was carrying some sort of unbearable burden, which he had already resigned himself to doing. The traveler went out to the river, then moved along the coast over to the bay. No one else was over there at such an early hour, and the man simply sat by the water. He was just about to take the hood off when he heard footsteps behind him. A local old man had come to fish and stopped right next to him, then started to talk about something. The fisherman clearly just needed someone to listen, and not necessarily engage in active conversation. Working with the tackle, he told stories about his life, occasionally glancing over at the stranger. As they say, I'm not just talking to myself after all. The traveler was the last one who needed the extra company at this point, and so he slowly started to get up to leave. His movement was noticed, but right at that moment, the old man started getting bites on the line. The traveler was about to seize the opportunity and make his exit, but then the fisherman began talking about the meaning of life. These words by themselves would have been fine, but then to top it all off, the old man pulled a catch out of the water and was quickly working to take this first fish off the hook. The hooded man took a deep breath and asked the old man what he knew about the meaning of life. For some reason, the latter took offense to this question and began to mutter to himself. Then, the stranger decided to throw down his trump card and took off his hood. In place of a human head, he had one of a fish. The creature silently approached the trembling old man. The latter had already started praying, and Mr. Fish took the catch from him and threw it back in the water. I love this guy. I was actually fortunate enough to meet him just prior to him being placed at the Foundation. He's rather quiet and can be a bit irritable if asked stupid questions like whether or not he can talk to fish. He's currently at SCP Foundation Site 19 and is listed under the number 527. The object is classified as Euclid and has a fully human body with the exception of its head, which is like that of a fish, specifically the green barbus. The humanoid's height is approximately 5.5 feet, although other figures were not specified. Despite the anomalous build, Mr. Fish leads a completely human life. He's able to speak, see, hear, and so on. Foundation documents indicate that SCP-527's head performs functions similar to those of a human head. As far as his body goes, it does not deviate at all from the usual male Homo sapiens form. Also, the object lives in a standard humanoid container. SCP-527 appears to lead a completely normal life. It eats, sleeps, and generally speaking, satisfies all other physiological and psychological needs. It's not indicated whether it consumes solely human food, or whether it also enjoys worms and plankton. Apparently his whole fish theme ends with the appearance of his head. Mr. Fish was discovered in Boston back in 2002. 2 years later, he was taken to Site 19, where the object had been all this time, as well as what happened to it is still unknown. During its initial examination, scientists noticed a tattoo on the sole of its left foot. It was stated that the object was Mr. Fish, from the Little Misters by Dr. Wondertainment series. Knowing the characteristics of other anomalous entities on this list, the scientist requested an accompanying document from SCP-527. Mr. Fish provided a paper with a list of all the lords and the standard text from their creator. Prior to its containment, the object had first been interviewed by Dr. Baker. Mr. Fish cooperated voluntarily, although not exactly with much enthusiasm. The doctor posed a series of questions in order to identify and evaluate SCP-527's anomalous properties and characteristics. As it turns out, he's unable to breathe underwater and does not possess any special swimming abilities. Furthermore, Mr. Fish is not able to communicate or establish any contact with creatures that live in the water. The scientists speculated that SCP-527 may have acquired its head after being attacked by some fish or being exposed to a marine anomaly. But SCP-527 rejected this idea, claiming that it had looked like this since its inception. It's not indicated whether Mr. Fish was born in the usual sense of the word and grew up like any other person, or if he was actually created in such a form, which is more likely. The subject also claims to have no anomalous properties or abilities. Apparently, he's just a dude with a fish head. The subject had brought up the other little misters. He complained that Misters Lie, Stripes, Hot, and Sweetie all got interesting bells and whistles, yet he was only given a fish head. SCP-527 had maintained its composure, answering all the scientists' questions up till now he was asked about the reason behind his appearance. The researcher was curious if Mr. Fish knew why the creator made him that way. The object became a little aggravated, but the main idea within his answer was still very cut and dry. He had no idea whatsoever. Speaking of SCP-527, I'd like to touch on Herman Fuller's Circus of the Disquieting for just a moment. There's also a fish person among his artists. According to the concert poster, this creature was born in the very depths of the ocean, and it also has a human body and a fish head. Other than the similarities in appearance, there's actually no reason to think that there might be any connection between the two. Also, Mr. Fish has the Wondertainment logo stamped on his body and has provided the accompanying paper. Granted, one cannot simply exclude the possibility of these insignia having been forged. Another observation I've made is in regards to SCP-527's containment. First off, it's unclear what exactly took place from the moment the object was discovered in 2002 until its containment in 2004. Was it under surveillance and allowed to just roam around Boston? Or did they conduct experiments and do research? What sort of tests would even exist if the man doesn't have any anomalous properties? Furthermore, the location of the other little misters is classified. It would seem that they're all located in Hall 8, at Site 13, a piece of information acquired thanks to the author of the Mr. Life and Mr. Death file. Mr. Fish, for some reason though, was left over at Zone 19. It's actually quite plausible that this was a precaution taken against the Mr. Collector effect, if you want to call it that. I once heard a story about what happens after bringing together all the objects from this series. The person who did this woke up in the middle of the city with a list of the little misters in his pocket. This person had no recollection of who he was, nor what was happening. Then he saw thin threads stretching out from him to various objects, and the man suddenly realized that he was Mr. Collector. He gave the strings a little tug, and just like that, all the objects were in his hands. Then, people began to demand that their things be returned. A thought then arose in the man's mind that he must be doing something wrong, and that he had been someone else before. A man tried to retrieve his past name from the depths of his memory with the help of a string, but all he received was a series of numbers and letters. Now under arrest, Mr. Collector was worried about only two things: his lost items and the last memory of his former identity. He couldn't figure out what was meant by this 054. Now, I can't pretend that this story is for sure true, but Wondertainment for some reason is calling back the entire collection. Actually, while we're already on the topic of this Joker from the SCP world, why would Dr. Wondertainment create an anomalous creature with the only thing setting him apart from an ordinary person being a fish head? One can assume that the creator either experienced a creative crisis, or he simply decided he would taunt the Foundation. After all, why should everything need to have purpose behind it? The creator wanted to make a man with the head of a fish, and so he did. Either for amusement purposes or out of sheer and utter boredom. And since Foundation personnel are so accustomed to complex and dangerous anomalies, they're now unable to accept the simplicity of SCP-527's nature and appearance. He's literally just a man with a fish head. But you know what else came to mind? Since when do we just take anomalous humanoids at their word? Maybe this miscreant is actually lying about everything. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like. Meanwhile, I'm gonna go fishing.